Walk down any pet food aisle today, and it's easy to feel overwhelmed by the sheer number of options available. Every bag, pouch, and can seems to tout its superiority, but not all are created equal. So, how do you know what's truly best for your pet? And what's up with all these new ingredients and claims that you swear weren't such a big deal a year ago? Pet industry innovation moves fast. Sometimes so fast that novel concepts and new ingredients aren't always properly studied before they hit the market, leaving consumers even more confused and putting the long-term health of our pets in limbo. To help pet owners navigate this increasingly saturated space, we're bringing you the top 5 trends to watch in 2025. In today's episode, the first installment of our Trends to Watch in 2025 mini-series, we'll dive into the world of sustainable ingredient sourcing to discuss the phenomenon of greenwashing, how pet industry brands are selecting their raw materials more carefully to reduce their overall environmental impact, and the question of upcycling, a practice used in the pet nutrition industry for decades, but now taking a different approach to minimize the hundreds of billions of pounds of food that wind up in landfills each year. Later this week, we'll share additional episodes about 4 more trends expected to shape the industry's future, including alternative protein sources, the promising power of biotic ingredients, the state of sustainable packaging, and the rise of personalized pet nutrition. So, as you enter 2025 with fresh eyes and a renewed commitment for going to the gym, eating healthier, being better at self-care, or whatever it is on your New Year's resolution list, you can use the information from today's episode and the 4 others we'll release this week to gain a better understanding of each of these trends so you can ensure your furry companion is getting the very best. Welcome to Barking Mad, a podcast by BSM Partners. I'm your host, Jordan Tyler. So when we were sitting down to research and put this episode together, we came up with a long list of trends. This was done in part through BSM Aperture, which is a powerful predictive tool under the BSM Partners umbrella, as well as the company's collective pet industry experience, which is pretty vast. And while all these trends are important, we decided to focus on the 5 that we felt are most likely to drive industry sales in 2025, as well as those that pet parents may find most confusing. Take sustainability, for example. Sustainability means something different to everyone, making it incredibly difficult to compare one company or brand's initiatives to another. This sentiment was shared by Emily Mesnier, Vice President of European Operations at BSM Partners, a pet food palatability expert by trade and sustainability guru by choice.
To me, sustainability is a way of life, right? But in pet food, it transcends simply swapping out ingredients or using recycled or recyclable packaging. To me, sustainability is about a holistic shift in mindset, considering the entire life cycle of a product from farm to bowl, because it impacts the planet, animals, people, and our industry.
Emily explains part of why sustainability is so complex is because it's interconnected to so many other values and purchasing decisions and involves not only science, but also human emotion.
For most US consumers, sustainability is often a feeling rather than a concrete definition. Pet parents might identify or associate sustainability with vague notions of being good or doing the right thing for the environment. And this highlights the need for clear and compelling communication, meaningful storytelling, and tangible examples and solutions to bridge the gap between consumer perception and actual sustainability practices. So for pet parents today, in the US, they do not want to compromise on health or convenience for sustainability. In contrast, in Europe, sustainability is often seen as a baseline expectation. While in the US, it can still be perceived as a premium or a niche attribute. This difference in market maturity presents both challenges and opportunities for pet food companies. European companies might need to focus on differentiation and innovation to stay ahead of the curve, while US companies may have the opportunity to leverage sustainability as a true competitive advantage.
Now, sustainability reporting tools like life cycle analyses, which is a way of measuring one input against another in terms of total environmental impact from farm to fork and beyond, as well as concepts like extended producer responsibility, or EPR, in which corporations are qualifying environmental impacts as part of their bottom line and prioritizing the reduction of emissions and waste across their supply chains, are advancing with speed toward the goal of creating a more environmentally friendly industry. However, there is a phenomenon that's caused some consumers to proceed with caution. Greenwashing is where companies dress up their product packaging, websites, and marketing materials to deceptively lead consumers to believe their products are environmentally friendly. Deceptively is the key word here, as companies that employ greenwashing tactics are actively misleading shoppers to a conclusion that just isn't true. A great example of this is Dieselgate, the 2015 scandal in which well-known German car manufacturer Volkswagen was called out for greenwashing. Now, according to a report from BBC explaining the scandal, Volkswagen had installed what they called defeat devices, or software that could detect when official emissions testing was being done on its car's diesel engines. So, when the United States conducted their testing, these defeat devices effectively altered the performance of the engines to improve emissions results. But here's the catch. The defeat devices only turned on during official testing to warp the results. But when a regular old person bought this car and took it for a spin, the emissions coming from that car would be much higher because the defeat devices were only meant to skew testing results, not actually reduce real emissions. Now, as I say to my dog when he uses his front paws during a match of tug of war, that's cheating. The company was eventually called out by the Environmental Protection Agency, leading them to publicly admit their wrongdoing.
So greenwashing is one of the most complex things to address with sustainability as well. It erodes consumer trust. It undermines genuine efforts to make the pet food industry more sustainable. So it is a serious problem that needs to be addressed through greater transparency, stricter regulations, and increased consumer awareness, right? We need to arm them with how to recognize when things may not be accurate or believable, right? And the lack of clear definition and standardized metrics for pet food sustainability make it easier for companies to make misleading claims. So I think really what we need is a robust third-party audits and certification system that could help the pet food industry and pet parents and animals in the same token. This would help to level the playing field and empower pet parents to make informed choices based on verified sustainability practice, knowing that we all have limited time on our hand to do this research.
Quick plug, we'll be exploring the world of pet industry sustainability this year and beyond in our up-and-coming sustainability series. Stay tuned for several fascinating episodes about regenerative agricultural practices and initiatives, upcycled ingredients, sustainable packaging, cat litter, alternative proteins, and much, much more. Now, while greenwashing isn't the trend per se, it is an important aspect of sustainable ingredient sourcing, which is the trend we'll get to here in a minute. And this is important to be aware of because pet parents and consumers in general need to know about these shammy practices so that they can ensure they're not being duped by corporations and brands who want us to believe they're doing more good than they really are. Now, let me hop off my soapbox and let's get into this trend. So when it comes to sustainability, being mindful of ingredient sourcing is a huge opportunity for the pet food industry, as most companies' greatest emissions don't actually come directly from its manufacturing operations, but rather what happens on either side of the process. So if you're supply chain savvy, you'll understand this as upstream and downstream activities, wherein upstream activities refer to things like raw material sourcing for ingredients, packaging materials, and other crucial inputs, while downstream refers to things like transporting the products from the facility to a warehouse or a retail location, or directly to somebody's doorstep, depending on their business model. So when you think about the upstream portion of the supply chain, ingredient sourcing falls directly into that category. And when you think about it, reducing the environmental impact of ingredients is really a two-way street. Both the company supplying the ingredients and the company transforming those ingredients into finished products must be committed to sustainable sourcing. And providing data to prove an ingredient is more sustainably sourced than another becomes super important to avoid greenwashing and help both parties achieve their sustainability goals. Joining us to discuss just how the pet industry is tackling sustainable ingredient sourcing is Allison Reeser, Director of Sustainability and Innovation at the Pet Sustainability Coalition, an organization dedicated to supporting pet industry companies as they seek to become more sustainable.
I would say there's 3 topics that companies are tackling with their sourcing. First is low carbon ingredients, so seeing how their sourcing strategy can level up to their overall emissions targets. The next is traceable, so making sure that they know where their ingredients are coming from, because that's a huge benefit for understanding the impact. And then the third is animal welfare. I think that makes a lot of sense for the pet industry because we inherently care about our pets and want to feed them healthy food and think about their animal welfare, but then also thinking about the welfare of the animals that are being used as ingredients, the chickens and the cows in that way. There's also 2 different approaches that I'm seeing a lot. So first is I'm seeing brands and manufacturers take a look at existing recipes and say like, okay, how can we keep this same recipe, but really engage with our supply chain to improve one of those topics that I just mentioned or something else. The other method I'm seeing is some companies are designing entirely new products with these sorts of qualities, environmental and social benefit in mind, which is very exciting to see.
So there's actually an interesting subtrend in the world of sustainable sourcing that we've identified, and this subtrend is upcycling. Now, upcycling is not a new concept, but the idea of upcycling food that would otherwise go to waste into dog and cat food and treats is gaining traction. And while this trend is definitely still in its early stages and its widespread adoption in the market remains to be seen, it does pose an exciting way to reduce the absolutely monumental food waste that we accumulate each year. According to Refed, a nonprofit dedicated to solving the systemic issue of food waste in the United States, the average American spent nearly $800 on food that ended up uneaten in 2023. And collectively, this totaled $264 billion worth of wasted food. The annual greenhouse gas emissions from that wasted food are estimated at around 205 million metric tons of CO2, which is, as Refed equated, the same as driving more than 49 million passenger vehicles for a year. And the amount of water used to grow that food is projected at nearly 11 trillion gallons, which is enough to fill 16 million Olympic-sized swimming pools. So not only is this a huge environmental problem, it's also a huge economic issue. It is important, though, to note the current challenges facing the upcycling movement, like how a lack of clarity around the term upcycled could actually lead to greenwashing.
Upcycling ingredients is all about maintaining food at its highest value. There are some really alarming statistics that also come from the upcycledfood.org site and also Project Drawdown, but 1/3 of our food is never eaten. And that leads to so many greenhouse gas emissions and just like a shame. So making sure that that food is not wasted is a huge opportunity for all things that eat. But I also, again, think it's a little tricky to think about like, okay, what would have gone to waste?
So perhaps further defining what constitutes an upcycled food ingredient or what kinds of food should be targeted for upcycling would be helpful. But here's another thing. The pet food industry has been upcycling since way before it was cool, through the use of rendered byproducts from the human food supply chain, specifically animal byproducts. So think of like you go to the store, you buy a steak. That steak is not the only thing that came from that cow, right? There are all sorts of other parts that never even make it to the meat section of the grocery store because culturally, there are certain parts of the animal that we simply won't eat as Americans. We'll get to that a little bit later. The point I want to make here first is people get really worked up about byproducts being nasty and gross and unfit for consumption. But I'd like to point out that while meat byproducts like trimmings and organ meats get a bad rap, they're actually really, really great sources of nutrition for pets. And they save valuable nutrients, those meaty ingredients that used up a ton of natural resources for the chance to become food, from just wasting away in a landfill.
The pet food industry complements the human food industry really beautifully because there are some parts of plants and animals that are super nutritious for pets and healthy, but not necessarily, again, they don't find their way into human food a lot. Animal byproducts fit into that category. And byproducts kind of needs a brand refresh because it's such that word doesn't feel very good, but it's all the organ meats that tend to be sent to rendering or something. Those have a huge opportunity in pet food and can complement the human food industry.
Now, in a minute, we'll hear about some of the companies making upcycled ingredients for use in animal food, as well as some brands that are proudly incorporating such upcycled ingredients into their finished pet food and treat products. But first, while we're talking about rendering and greenwashing, I want to address a statistic that's been floating around for some years now and maybe deserves another closer look. This statistic comes from a peer-reviewed paper by Gregory Oken, published in 2017, which states that through their diet, the American dog and cat population constitutes about 25 to 30% of the environmental impacts from animal production in terms of the use of land, water, fossil fuel, phosphate, and biocides. By way of solution, Oken suggests in the paper that reducing the rate of dog and cat ownership in the United States, as well as industry-wide efforts to reduce overfeeding, waste, and find alternative sources of protein, would reduce these impacts. So we could just stop having pets, although that comes off to me as a little eco-fascist, and you'd really have to twist my arm to make me believe that that's the only solution here. And the industry is already exploring alternative proteins, which we will discuss more in our second Trends of 2025 episode coming out tomorrow. But as we're thinking about this 25 to 30% statistic, what about the rendered byproducts we just mentioned? These byproducts are made up of all the parts of an animal that humans refuse to eat. So organ meats, bone meal, and other parts we find unsavory but are perfectly edible and actually super nutritious. And if we don't do something with them, they're just going to go to waste. Now, I'm going to read a passage from this report that kind of serves to make the point I'm trying to make here. He says, it could be argued that dogs and cats eat meat that humans cannot consume, and which is simply a byproduct of production for human use, and therefore should not be counted as consumption beyond that of humans. To some extent, this is certainly true. Humans, for instance, do not generally consume bone meal, a common ingredient. But other ingredients in pet food that are byproducts of human meat production are certainly edible after processing. Now, the phrase certainly edible after processing and another, which is readily accepted at the dinner table, are completely different things. Like, yeah, organ meats are a delicacy in certain cultures, but you would be hard-pressed to find a tried and true American that isn't skeptical about adding those ingredients into their diets. And I'm not saying that's a good thing. You know, incorporating more animal byproducts into our own diets is maybe something we should look into. And I know personally, I'd certainly try that before giving my own dogs and cats the boot. And, you know, I'm not doing this to bag. And Oken does make some arguments in here that are more compelling, in my opinion, like how the humanization of pet food, like using human-grade meats to produce pet food instead of byproducts of those ingredient streams, is actually placing dog and cat food in direct competition with human food in terms of the supply chain. That I actually agree with, and there's a delicate balance to be struck there for sure. But my point here is this. If byproducts are lumped into the environmental impact of our dogs and cats' consumption of animals, and then we stopped feeding animals byproducts or stopped keeping pets altogether, there would be no market for these ingredients. It would just mean a pile of animal products deemed unfit for human consumption under today's conventional standards. And that pile would grow and grow with nowhere to go but the landfill or contaminating our oceans. So really, if we didn't have pet food as a viable stream for these ingredients, they would be going to waste. And in my opinion, this makes rendered byproducts an OG champion of upcycling. Okay. I don't remember getting back up on my soapbox, but here we are. I just felt that was a really important point to make because that 25 to 30% statistic gets thrown around a lot, but I fear it's actually serving to exaggerate what's really going on to the point where it could be considered greenwashing, especially for the positive impact that rendered ingredients in pet food already have on the environment and have for decades. Okay, let's get back to upcycled ingredients. Today and in the future, ugly produce and food items that don't sell in the store but are perfectly delicious and nutritious otherwise have another way to be recovered through a company called California Safe Soil, or CSS, which originally used these food products to create all-natural fertilizers and is now bringing their business model to the pet nutrition space. CSS works closely with grocery stores to recover food, maintains a strict cold chain, in other words, transportation that keeps the food cold and fresh between the store and CSS facilities, and sorts out any garlic, onions, or other food items known to be harmful to pets before embarking on a process called enzymatic digestion to create its final pet food ingredient for manufacturers to incorporate in their products. Here's Dan Marash, founding partner at CSS, to explain a little bit more about how that process works.
It's basically biomimicry. What we're doing is the same thing that happens in your stomach, where you digest your food with enzymes, which therefore breaks the food down. That process of enzymatic digestion is something that is very efficient at breaking food down into its constituent elements that can then, particularly once it's pasteurized and stabilized, you can get the value of the food the same way you get value from food when you digest it yourself.
So if any of y'all listen to the Barking Mad trailer, you know that I have a dog with exocrine pancreatic insufficiency, or EPI, which basically means his pancreas doesn't naturally produce the enzymes he needs to digest proteins, fats, and sugars properly on his own. So when Dan started explaining enzymatic digestion, I was like, this sounds a lot like what we have to do for Lenny every morning and every night. So to help him be able to digest the nutrients in his food, we sprinkle a blend of digestive enzymes on every meal. We slosh it around with a little bit of water and then let it sit and digest in the bowl for up to 20 minutes before he can actually dig in. So this pre-digestion is essentially what CSS is doing, just on a much, much larger scale, and for the good of not just my dog, but other dogs and the planet. Anyway, enzymatic digestion is one great way to upcycle. But just to kind of drive this trend home, there are a handful of brands that have launched products made with upcycled ingredients in the recent years, including Shameless Pets, which takes misfit and surplus produce, eggshells, seafood, and other ingredients, and incorporates them into nutritious pet treats that also pack a punch of functional health benefits at the same time. Another company, Phelps Pet Products, which co-manufactures jerky-style treats for a variety of brand names and private labels, has robust capabilities for putting upcycled ingredients in its treats, including through an exclusive licensing agreement with Disney inked in 2021, through which the company has created a line of Disney character-inspired treats, most of which carry the Upcycled certified label. And then there's also Ag Alchemy, another co-manufacturer based in the Midwest that incorporates upcycled bakery products and produce into its pet treats, but then goes a step further and also includes biotics, another fascinating trend we'll discuss here in a minute, to not only recover food waste, but also support a pet's gut microbiome and health. Ag Alchemy is also USDA organic certified, so really hitting on some important priorities for consumers there. Now, there are others, of course, but as the supply chain infrastructure for upcycling ingredients ramps up alongside new companies entering this space, this will certainly be a trend to watch in 2025 and beyond. There's one more ingredient sourcing sub-trend I want to bring up today before we wrap up this episode, and that's regenerative agriculture. The Pet Sustainability Coalition has its boots on the ground in this space, facilitating the adoption of regeneratively sourced ingredients through a USDA climate-smart commodity grant called Growing Grass, according to Allison.
It's all about increasing the use of regeneratively raised beef and bison byproducts in pet food. So that's been a really fun initiative. And just a few sentences on regenerative agriculture. It's a way of farming and ranching that uses grazing animals over the land, and their hoofs and a variety of things are really good for soil health and carbon sequestration, among many benefits.
Now, the 21st century has seen a sizable push for farmers and ranchers to adopt more sustainable practices and really be positive stewards of their land. And in recent years, this has evolved into a sharper focus on regenerative agriculture, which, according to the National Resource Defense Council, or NRDC, is a holistic land management philosophy that recognizes how soil, water, crops, people, and animals are elements of one interconnected system. And while there is no one definition for regenerative agriculture, at least not yet, these practices aim to empower farmers and ranchers by helping them to reduce their carbon emissions, conserve water, keep it clean, safeguard biodiversity within the soil and on the farm, reduce the use of synthetic fertilizers and other chemicals, grow foods that are actually healthier and more nutrient dense, and fairly compensate and support farm workers and the communities in which crops are grown and animals are raised. All of this, according to the NRDC, is to ensure the long-term vitality of the land. In the pet industry, there are a few brands proudly partnering with regenerative farmers and ranchers, but we're not doing spoilers today. You're going to have to wait for an upcoming episode in our sustainability series, in which we'll sit down with regenerative agriculture champions inside and outside of the pet nutrition space to learn more about why this trend is important and how it might evolve over time. Sorry, not sorry for the cliffhanger, but be sure to stay tuned as that episode will come out in the first quarter of 2025. And with that, we've reached the end of our first trend to watch in 2025. From understanding greenwashing to exploring the exciting world of upcycled ingredients, debunking reservations around rendered byproducts, and the potential of regenerative agriculture, it's clear that sustainable sourcing is here to stay and will continue to shift how the pet food industry thinks about and works to address its environmental impact. Be sure to come back tomorrow as we dive into our second trend of 2025, alternative proteins. You will not want to miss a fascinating conversation about how cultivated and fermented meats and insect proteins might reshape the future of pet nutrition. But the keyword here is might. And that's all I'll say ahead of the episode. In the meantime, thank you for tuning in to Barking Mad, a podcast by BSM Partners. If you'd like to learn more about us, please visit our website at www.bsmpartners.net. Don't forget to subscribe on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And if you enjoyed today's episode, share it with a fellow pet lover and leave us a review. Lastly, be sure to stay tuned for more insights this week from our Trends 2025 miniseries, as well as future episodes on pet care innovation, sustainability, and other hard-hitting topics you won't want to miss. We'd like to thank our dedicated team in support of this episode: Adamiette Thomas, Neely Bowden, Kate Wright, and Dr. Katie Miller. A special thanks to Leanne Haggerty and Michael Johnson. See you next time!